Good morning and a warm welcome to everyone here. The sun is coming out, I see, coming through the rain. Welcome. And welcome also to the audience for this second session of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference from Bocas, NGC Bocas Litfest in Trinidad. On behalf of the Edinburgh International World Writers' Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council, a very warm welcome. Second session here in Trinidad. It's very exciting to have a further discussion following on from yesterday's. I'll just repeat some of the things I said yesterday for those of you who weren't here. This is part of a worldwide conversation which is taking place physically in a series of 12 international literature festivals around the globe, as well as in Edinburgh, with two, as it were, bookmarks: the Edinburgh International Book Festival last August and the next edition of the Edinburgh International Book Festival in August 2013, looking at themes which arose at the 1962 Edinburgh Writers' Conference, which was in many ways a seminal conference and indeed a seminal literature festival. Literature festivals as such hadn't really happened before that time in the 1960s in the form that they took on subsequently. So a very warm welcome once again, and I just mentioned that people who wish to tweet may do so following hashtag World Writers Conf, Edinburgh World Writers Conf. And that the next series in the series take place in 4 cities before the wind-up in Edinburgh, in 4 different countries, in Australia, Malaysia, France, and Portugal. We're very delighted that one of the 2 festivals which have hosted this relay in the Americas is here in the Caribbean. The other one was in North America, in Toronto, last October, the International Festival of Authors. And it's thrilling that here in the Caribbean, where so many different currents of the history of the Americas and so many currents of the history of the relationship between the Americas and Africa and Europe intersect, it's very fitting that here the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference has a Caribbean dimension, thanks to our hosts and partners, Bocas. Marina, Director of Bocas. Thank you once again.
Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all here. We're really, really pleased to be included in this World Writers' Conference because, as David was saying, there's so much going on here, and I think it's a vote of confidence that we were included, so thank you very much to the Edinburgh World Writers, to the Edinburgh International Book Festival and to British Council for inviting us to take part. And all of you who were here yesterday know that there's a lot to be said. And Anu Lakan was boasting that this was going to be the one that nobody forgets. And I think that maybe yesterday, Anu, you were pleased that you think that we behaved badly now?
We can take it up a little bit.
Oh, she wants you to behave even more bad.
Or take it down a notch.
Okay, no, behave more bad today, she says. Okay. We're going to leave you in the hands of Fiona Fulani, who is an academic and a writer. And of course, what we're going to be discussing this morning with this wonderful panel is whether literature should be political or not. And you will remember that in the opening event on Thursday morning, which seems a long time ago now, we were looking ahead to this moment. And we had some people reading, some distinguished people from Trinidad and Tobago, reading texts that have been political, that date right back to the 1940s. So let's hear what our panel will have to say about this theme this morning. Would you please welcome Fiona Fulani and the team of debaters?
Hello, everyone. I'm going to get straight into introducing the panel. I'm going to get straight into introducing the keynote speaker and the panel, starting with Olive Senior, who I know needs no introduction to this audience. Olive is a celebrated and distinguished writer who is at home writing fiction, writing nonfiction, writing poetry. Her most recent novel is Dancing Lessons, published in 2012. Olive resides in Toronto, but she tells me she really lives in Jamaica. All right. Earl Lovelace also needs no introduction. Earl is a national treasure, a celebrated author of many novels, including the classics The Dragon Can't Dance and Wine of Astonishment. His most recent novel, Tis Just a Movie, was the winner of last year's OCM Bocas Prize, and Earl lives right here in Port of Spain. I'd like to introduce Courtier Newland, who is here from London, where he's based. Courtier imagines himself as placed in a sort of transnational community of African diasporic writers, as well as being a Black British writer. Right? He's the author of many novels, also of crime fiction, also of short fiction, and he's currently working on a science fiction novel, right? Yeah. To my left here, and I think I might be hiding him, obscuring him, is Pankaj Mishra, who is a novelist who also writes about history and about religion. His most recent book, From the Ruins of Empire, was published in 2012 and received much acclaim. Pankaj divides his time unsatisfactorily, he tells me, between India and London. So let's hear from our keynote speaker, Olive Senior, who's going to address this very, very capacious and aged question, should literature be political?
Okay, does it sound good at the back? Okay. Should literature be political? Well, first I have to take issue with the title, which has a fussiness of granny about it. It suggests an anxiety about written literature, the notion that literary production is something precious and should be somehow protected from the unwashed hordes who are political animals because they foment revolutions and overturn thrones. Mark you, the unwashed hordes have created literature too, though it's been called folklore and folk song. And now, whoa, technology has opened the door to everyone calling him or herself a writer. Okay, the question has been asked, so let's try to be serious about it, especially since it is asked in the context of literary festivals like this one, which is celebrating the literature that is confined within the pages of a book. Let us start by defining what is meant by our use of literature here, and even more important, what we mean by politics. I will use literature here, not in its broadest sense of embracing all literary production. I'm using it in reference to works of the creative imagination, fiction, poetry, drama, in whatever form these are expressed, since technology now opens up so many worlds beyond the artifact we normally call a book. So our concern here is with content. We should treat works of the creative imagination as different from other forms of literary production. This distinction enables us to see and acknowledge that the writer who wants to make a statement has a wide choice of genre, and that each genre has its place. Many writers, like myself, have engaged in a variety of these genres, but we must be clear in our own minds as to what we are doing. Non-creative literature operates according to a conscious mandate. Creative literature does not. Fabrication by a journalist is regarded as betrayal. Fabrication is what a fiction writer does. On to politics. Anxiety arises from our narrow use of the term. We tend to think of politics exclusively in terms of partisan politics, electoral politics, political leadership, and so on, with strife and confrontation implied. So a lot of people try to disengage by saying, I am not concerned with politics. The bottom line is that the word politics conjures up partisanship, divisiveness, and a low threshold of scoring dirty points against an opponent. But politics, in its very first definition, relates to the art of government. We might refer to that as Big P, because I want to make a case that Big P, the larger politics of the nation, inescapably shapes us in a trickle-down effect from the cradle to the grave. Politics determines the price of bread or the availability of guns, or whether one lives in splendor or the squalor of a refugee camp. Closer to home, it might be the Caribbean mother having to choose between bread today and school fees tomorrow. Big P shapes the world into which we're born, our daily environment, and leads to what we might call small p politics, all those decisions of personal governance that we're forced to make, both externally and unconsciously, every moment of our lives. We are all enmeshed in politics because we're all citizens of somewhere, even writers, and we cannot escape being shaped by political decisions, big and small. So, instead of asking the question, should literature be political, I would rephrase it as a statement. Literature is political because we, the creators of literature, are political animals. It is part of accepting our responsibility of being human, of being citizens of the world. Does this mean that I'm advocating that literature, as I've narrowly defined it, should be in the service of politics? Absolutely not. This is where creative writers must part company with those writers who operate out of a mandate that is overt and prescriptive. Consumers of each genre usually know what to expect, and creative literature works best if we do not know what to expect. Literature, in this narrow sense, is, above all, a product of imagination. The gift of the creative industries is to present the unexpected, to show the world in a different light. Every author has a worldview which reflects a political stance and shapes what we do, even unconsciously. For example, as a child, I grew up in a world where I never saw myself or the people around me visually portrayed in the children's books I read, though I have to confess I took great pleasure in reading them. As a writer of children's books now, I must say I'm simply concerned with telling a story that a child anywhere in the world might want to read. But I have to confess, I am very much concerned that the illustrations should reflect and express a multicultural world, for that is what I live in. Is that political? Can any of us escape the political? I would say no, because even romantic literature plunges us into the realm of political economy. Does the potential suitor have a job? The raw material of writers is the entire world that we live in, a world that continuously shapes us as we in turn shape it through our poetry or fiction. The writer is someone who has no choice but to be engaged with society, which means political engagement. Nothing escapes the snare of the political, big P or small p. It is about the price of bread, the paycheck you bring home, how you interact with neighbors, or whom you choose to romance. You can rebel against the latter or hew your own path, but your choice will be shaped by political concerns. And those concerns have always included religion, race or ethnicity, sex, and gender. Today, perhaps more than ever. So what makes literature different then from the other arts of writing, journalism, history, political science, advertising, or party propaganda? To me, that is the crux of the matter. The difference lies in not what we write, but in the how. It is the difference between, say, a journalist writing a story about, for example, the shortage of public housing, and the novelist inventing a character and a credible situation to demonstrate the impact of that situation, perhaps down several generations, or how it leads ultimately to a revolution or a suicide. It is taking the facts of the matter and then stitching them into a plot or a poem that illuminates it beyond the everyday experience. The good thing is that in doing so, the creative writer has enormous resources that the fact-based writer has not. Literature is an art. It is about transformation. It is about taking one thing and making something else of it, changed but recognizable. So politics might be the subject matter, but only as raw material. Literature does not need to employ polemics or confrontation, nor is it about telling readers what they already know, but enabling them to contemplate what they didn't know they knew. It is not a question of avoiding issues, but of being crafty, like the politician, in portraying them. Literature is above all storytelling. And as Chinua Achebe has said, storytelling is a threat. Storytellers, poets, writers have always found ways of confronting tyranny, especially in spaces where such actions are dangerous and deadly. Throughout the ages, writers have developed and employed myriad literary devices and explored the fullest limits of language through, for example, satire, magical realism, fantasy, fable, and so on. So writers over the ages have found ways of talking about issues like politics without seeming to talk about them. The function is not to present the world as it is, but to present it in a new light through the narrative power of art. Literature does not ask, what is it about? It asks, how do we tell it to make it real? So, since I have to answer the question, should literature be political? I will say yes, but not in an explicit way. The purpose of literature is not to represent, but to represent, to hold up that mirror in a light that enables us to see reality both reflected and refracted. And that applies to politics or any subject that we choose, or in the best case scenario, in the subject that chooses us. As writers, we live lives that are not navel-gazing, but conscious, fully engaged with the world. Maybe I should say as Caribbean writers. My favorite quotation is Gauguin's statement, art is either plagiarism or revolution. So let me end by taking issue with the title of this debate, especially with the prescriptive should. Should the subject matter of literature be prescribed by anyone? I say no. So let's end by revolting against those who would apply the word should to art, even in a question. To young writers, I say, ignore prescriptions. Don't be left behind. Write on. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Olive, for that very provocative, but also very definite response to the question. And it's a response that the members of the panel share. We're all very much in agreement that literature simply is political, right? But I want to pick up on a couple of points that you made that are provocative for writers, I think. That writers should be crafty like politicians, right? That writers should not represent, writers should present, right? And I want to use those ideas as jumping off points for the rest of the panel to actually share with us their experiences, their thoughts about what it is to write politically while writing imaginatively. All right, starting with Earl.
You start with a good person. I think we all placed in some, we born in a place and we born in a position and we try to represent that, you know. I think that, I mean, I can remember like Olive when I was a little boy and we had this hymn book, not hymn book, Negro spiritual book, you know, everybody had one apparently. And there was this song, Old Black Joe. And he said, Master and Missy have long gone before me. Soon we shall meet on the bright and golden shore. That was part of the song that stuck in my head for a long time. And I always felt that that wasn't enough for Old Black Joe, you know. And so I've been pursuing the idea of presenting yourself as a person in a place. And I think for me, the question has been, how do you take your place in the world? You know, and whatever, and you have a place. You're not asking anybody's permission. You're not doing anything. You're taking your place. And it would require many things. It would require persuasion. It would require perhaps the idea of threat, you know. But this is what you have to do. And I think as writers also, I see us as being, or I see myself as belonging to the cultural resistance and cultural rebellion, that we are perhaps the latest representative of the cultural rebellion, which has to some extent been co-opted, and we have to function in that role. So I know this is not, I will come back again, you know, but let me say this for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Co-chair.
I suppose for me, it's just about it being able to exist in the realm of the imagination at all, you know. Growing up in London, in England, I very much felt that myself and the people around me were largely just unseen. We were written out in a sense, you know. So, you know, I remember reading my Peter and Jane books when I was a child, and, you know, it was all, you know, blonde-headed children, blue-eyed children, and I couldn't see myself in those books. And at the time, obviously, that didn't worry me so much. I didn't know any different, you know, but I could see the worry in my mother's face, you know, when she was saying, you know, Courtier's reading, and it's good that he's reading, but what is he reading, and how is this going to affect him later? And, you know, how it's very important that I got to read books where I could see a reflection, you know, of myself. So then, as a writer, I began to realize how powerful that insertion of my own culture, my own beliefs, my own persona into the realm of the imagination would be for not just myself, but for other people. How it might reinforce more or less our humanity, you know, who we actually really are. And, you know, and from then on, I've pursued that.
Thank you. Earl, you're asserting the need of the individual to claim their place in the world and to struggle in order to do that. And Courtier, you're commenting on your own need to claim a place in the world of the imagination, and your own struggles to do that through writing, right? Points you have more or less in common. Pankaj.
Well, I think both, in fact, all of you reinforce the notion of writing as a form of resistance, especially if you come from a non-Western, non-affluent society, which hasn't produced a whole lot of modern literature of its own, and where you are constantly receiving literature produced elsewhere and imported in, where you can't find reflections of yourself. So obviously writing in that context is, as you say, an act of asserting one's humanity, first of all. So it is a political intervention from the very beginning, from the moment you start conceiving of yourself as a writer. So I think then to go back to your problems with the way this motion has been phrased, who is this question meant for? Should writing be political? And I would venture to say that this question is more pertinently posed to writers today in the Anglo-American world, where literature was political for a very long time. And I mean political in this broad sense of writers being aware of conflict and violence beyond the domestic, of the persistence, the existence of inequality, not just cultural inequality, socioeconomic inequality. And if you look at the canonical writers of Europe and America in the 19th century or the early 20th century, they were all intensely aware of these larger conflicts in their society and how they impacted individual lives. But in the last 50, 60 years, since the end of the Second World War, we have seen in Anglo-America the rise of a studiedly, deliberately apolitical literature, where to be political is to be somehow less serious or to be not committed enough to the aesthetic of the novel or to the aesthetic of literature. So I'll stop here, but that's something I wanted to bring up.
Can I ask a question? Because I entirely agree with you about the timing and the literature now in the Anglo-American world, and I wonder if it's related to prosperity. In other words, literatures arise out of tumult, even Europe and so on, out of the times in which we live, and that the reflection that the literature that's produced is a reflection of the times, of the prosperity or stability of a particular country, and whether a certain form of capitalism doesn't produce what I call navel gazing by writers and artists,
Well, I don't know. I think we have a situation where I forget what I was going to say.
Well, I want to follow on from Pankaj's point to ask about the value of creative writing programs and the industry.
Oh, sorry, I remember. I was wondering.
I'll come back to that. By which time I've forgotten.
Yeah, I was wondering whether that attitude hadn't something to do with what we call post-colonialism, that we were moving from a period of being colonized to a period of independence. And suddenly the idea of independence has been washed away completely. And what we seem to have is an idea of post-colonialism, maintaining the colonial presence, and in fact not really dealing at all with the idea of an emergent independence. And I think that a lot of things have contributed to that, both that and the language actually of academia, the language in which things are presented. Instead of people dealing with your literature here, they have to go and learn literary theory. Whereas before they would look at a novel or play or whatever, and be able to critique it as a sensitive, understanding, bright human being. But suddenly they have to deal with it from this other world. So what has been happening in a kind of way that the supposed messages that we are sending out from this part of the world are not reaching even to ourselves. We even fail to have people critiquing very much in our own space.
Can I just say that in the UK, I suppose, that manifests itself in terms of a post-colonial psyche, as opposed to what Earl is talking about. So we actually seem to just understand ourselves only in terms of being post-colonial, only in terms of being other, only in terms of identity, not in terms of being fully rounded human beings. And in fact, if you try to articulate that as a writer, you try to put that into the realm of the industry, then you're in fact not allowed to speak in a sense. You are cut off in a sense, and you're not allowed to produce.
So I suppose, what you're describing in effect is a kind of compartmentalization of literature, kind of category construction where people are put in their respective ghettos and also diffused. The writing is diffused at the same time. But I want to go back to, I think these are very real dangers, but also the point you raised about prosperity, the surface of prosperity at least, because most people are not prosperous in these societies, managing to hide the kind of violence that still goes on in these societies. The prosperity that also, let's not forget, seduces the figure of the writer. The writer is also very much now part of this whole society in which prosperity is an aspiration for everyone. And the writer is also cut off from the spectacle of violence, from the sources of violence. So
kind of sanitized.
absolutely,
Very much
absolutely.
so. Yeah. Well, this leads me to the question of the publishing industry and the politics that shape it and drive it, and the literature industry, right? The literature marketplace. And I wondered how each of you have, experienced being in those spheres and how you've negotiated the politics of those spheres, what your thoughts are about the way, that need for involvement, if you feel it, actually shapes your writing or influences your writing.
Could you just restate the question?
How has your experience of being sort of published, being involved in the industry of publishing, being involved in the business of literature production, right, shaped your career, shaped your writing? What you've had many years of experience in these arenas. What are your thoughts about the politics of these arenas?
Well, I was always concerned more about my politics than the politics of of anybody else, you know. And one went along, and I think that the ambition was really to help to change the place and to make a place, as it were. And it's kind of very difficult. It's been very difficult, and you seem, as soon as you make 2 steps forward, you make a few backwards. And so for me, the publishing industry by itself really didn't have any great impact. Of course, I think if the publishing, if the distribution was more seriously, well, I shouldn't say seriously, but pursued, if, for example, my books appeared with a different cover, with a girl on the cover, lounging on the beach or something, we would probably have more sales. If, for example, we sold books to the, the tourism industry, which exists in the Caribbean, and if the people who came here also had a book from the Caribbean, we would also have better sales. I think that the whole thing is that we have not been taken seriously, and in a kind of way we have to find ways in which we have to demand, not only to demand to be taken seriously, we have to take ourselves seriously and find ways, to find our way through all of this, the politics and the business.
Yeah, for myself, my entry into the industry was seeing myself engaged in a sense of writing back against literature as propaganda, I suppose. I mean, that's the way I saw it. Trying to correct the stereotypes that are put into the culture arena by the publishing industry about people like myself, and then but working from those stereotypes in a sense. So they had an idea of Black British people just in terms of criminality. They just said they're these working class people and they live on these estates and they do these things. And that's it, and they do these things for specific reasons. They didn't understand or try to understand the underlying reasons for things happening. Shootings, killings, stuff like that. Why people are involved in the drug trade, things like that. So for me myself, it was about trying to humanize that and put that into a socio-political perspective, and say, okay, well, these people have been put into this situation because of the wider framework around them, and also just in terms of humanizing their struggle. So that's what I did in the first instance with my first books. And then it was about moving away from that and trying to say, okay, there's also these other type of people who exist in this world, in this working class world. There are people who say are detectives, and there are people who are like lovers and dreamers, and just moving away from like that stereotype in a sense and expanding on the world.
How did publishers respond to your attempts to move away from the stereotypes?
Oh, not well at all.
Right.
Not well at all.
Yeah.
In fact, they consciously tried to stop me. So I started trying to move into science fiction. I started trying to move into experimental fiction. And they told me very firmly that I should stick to urban fiction. I was told that. By a publisher. And so I had to, in fact, move away from mainstream publishing.
So that's the politics of containment in the industry, containing you to a particular locality and associations with that locality. Yeah, Pankaj, I see you want to say something.
I actually speak as a beneficiary of the publishing interest in Indian writing in the 90s. which was great. It's faded a bit since, and it's been replaced by interest in Pakistani fiction and other supposedly other national literatures. But I remember at the time there were a whole lot of novels published, now forgotten justly, about mangoes and monsoon rains, and there was always a wise grandmother lurking somewhere there in those narratives. So there was this idea of Indian literature, and that was being highlighted. Now, a whole range of Indian writing was being suppressed at the same time. This was writing not just produced by writers in Indian languages, but also writers in English in India, which either did not get published or did not receive the attention they deserved. Quite recently, I found myself in Cairo and soon afterwards in Havana, and talking to writers there who had been visited by international publishers and agents during book fairs. It became very clear that the narrative they were looking at from Cuba, for instance, salsa had to be an important part of that narrative, and sex. And in Egypt, the narrative about the Muslim woman throwing off her veil was also very important. It was central. And other narratives, not so keen on those.
Especially those that interrogate
Absolutely.
The culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Olive, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, like Earl, I've been, involved with the publishing industry for a long time, and I have to say that my experience with my very first book really radicalized me and taught me all I need to know about the publishing industry, because it took me about 10 years to get Summer Lightning published, because publishers everywhere said, we love your work, but why don't you rewrite your stories in English? My work was, I'm using Jamaican Creole in English, and I didn't know what I was doing as a young writer, but I wanted to represent my world in an authentic kind of way. And so the book was eventually published because there was no way I was going to rewrite my material, but I've had the experience, for instance, of English editors in England, not my book editor, but editors of stories in anthologies, rewriting my Creole because they thought I didn't understand English.
Yeah.
And when I won Summer Lightning, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, there were some really rude comments in Canadian newspapers, and what they quoted was a little bit of Creole, and the implication was, oh, they've given this prize to this little primitive who lives in the hills of Jamaica. So so from the start there have been these stereotypes, but what it has done to me is affirmed my sense of who I want to be as a writer and the role I want to play, like Earl. Yeah. It is to represent my society in an authentic kind of way. And this still persists. So my attitude is, I've been fortunate in that I've been published widely. My books have been well reviewed. I have wonderful readers and so on. But I know, and I accepted long ago, I'll never make it commercially. I'll never have a book that's going to be a bestseller or anything, because I'm not prepared to go there. You have to, it's all formulaic, and nowadays in the publishing world it's getting more and more like that, because publishing is driven by commercial considerations. So you have to fit into whatever is fashionable at the moment. By the way, I have mangoes on the cover of my novel.
I apologize.
So I think our job is to, as Scorchia says, to write against the stereotypes. That is what I'm doing. Yes. I want to create in the body of my work a literature that is showing the real face of Jamaica and the Caribbean. That's all I can do. And that is what I think we should be doing to enable us to be taken seriously, not just outside, but as Earl says, by our own people. I go to Jamaica wherever people say, what do you do? I say, I'm a writer. And they said, oh, I'd be a writer too, if I had the time. I mean, there is still that attitude of that writing is something you do, if you had the time, or, and I think this is why events like this are so important to all of us, to enabling readers and writers to be in touch with each other and for us to recognize and respect each other. So, yeah.
I think what Earl said about having local intellectual literary forums where literature can be assessed, where people can engage in a conversation without constantly having to simplify for an external audience, without constantly projecting that literature abroad, having a conversation within a given territory. I see this happening in India now after 2 decades. There was not much of a publishing industry there in the late 80s when I first started writing. But since then, over time, there has developed a publishing industry, and that has allowed a kind of writing to flourish there, which would not have flourished otherwise if it was solely dependent on metropolitan networks of publishing and publicity.
Right. I agree that we have to depend first on ourselves, really, in so many ways. And what we look towards is the external market. I think that the market that we have to address, first of all, is right here, that we have to help people to understand what the value of literature. We have to carry readings to them. A whole number of things have to be done. If we want to build a society, we can't build it abroad. Can't build it outside of here. The reading has to be here. If the writers are to be influential, they have to influence people here. I mean, of course, there is going to be influence in relation, which I think has been kind of done. I mean, the people Lamming, a whole number of writers of a certain generation have been able to impact very well on the international scene. What we have not impacted on is on the local scene. And we have a wide Caribbean, and we have to deal with that. I think that has to be one of the very serious objectives, as well as to dealing both with adults and with children.
Great point. Some very interesting and provocative issues have been touched upon, and questions raised by the panelists so far. Questions of stereotyping, of forced categorization of your work, questions of cultivating a local audience in order to have an authentic market for your work, an appreciative market for your work, and others that I know you might want to address or interrogate as an audience. So I'm opening up the floor at this point for your questions. Yes. Oh, hands shooting up left, right, and center. At the very back there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm laden with purchases. I want to refer to what Ms. Senior said, because when I interjected at the forum on whether we should have a national sort of policy on what our literature is, and she said today the word should be removed. I want to agree with that, because I fear that anything we decide to let us debate this and then dismiss it and grow, because what you're going to have if we are going to define how we are going to have literature, and I take it we're talking fiction here, because political theses and memoirs and so don't really count, I suppose, must be free, not to have anybody political, and I even think in terms of ministries of culture who decide what book to sort of sponsor to help get it published because they like it politically or not. I think we must be very careful not to permit that sort of structure to come into the literature. I mean, we are all strangers in the Caribbean anyway. Not all of us. Tracy Assing is not here today. I think she is one of the very few who can claim to be bona fide from the Caribbean before we all came. But I worry that...
Are you building up to a question?
No, I suppose I'm not. So I will take my seat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Rodney Foster. I live in Atlanta. And as they were speaking here, I thought about the first book that influenced many of us who were born in Trinidad, the Bible. Should the Bible, or was the Bible, political? And I would really like us to address that, because I belonged to a church when I was in California the minister, some of you all might know him, James Lawson, who influenced Dr. Martin Luther King about nonviolence. And the congregation didn't like, some of them didn't like him because they said he was too political. This was a man who was talking about breaking down apartheid, and some of the members in the congregation didn't want to discuss that. And we see.
I think that's a great question, but for,
So that's my
but
question.
for a different forum. We're really concerned with Caribbean writing here.
Well, I'm saying we in the Caribbean, I was influenced by the Bible and my church. I went to Barataria EC school. We have our first introduction to the literature through some of the, whether it be the Quran or the Bible, and the teachers in the classrooms today, that's the biggest audience today.
Okay.
The churches are full with people, and we need to attack this politics
Okay, point taken.
in all forums. And the church and schools is one place where we can do that. That's my point. Thank you.
The Bible is political. Should we address that?
Well, I mean, you know, yeah, we'd need a whole year to talk about the Bible and all of this. I just want to say, though, that in the history of the Caribbean, religion has always been revolutionary, has always played a role in politics in that sense, from the liberation of the slaves to whatever. So just as a short answer to your question, yes, there is a role for the Bible in contemporary life and politics beyond just straight religion. But I don't think this is the space for us to get into a debate about religion and so on, with all due respect.
No, I was just going to say that I read the Bible. I mean, the Bible was one of my first books to read, you know, the Bible stories and so on. And I mean, there's a lot that we can get from the Bible. I don't know the sense in which you mean, this evangelical new sense. I don't quite follow. But I think that the Bible is important, or has been important, both for language and for ideas and for the story, you know. And I think for most writers, actually.
Good morning, Lisa Allen Agostini. I think that a lot of contemporary Caribbean writers are in fact talking about religion in a political way, and I'm talking specifically maybe about Kai Miller and Marlon James, whose work has dealt with religion and the politics of applying a certain paradigm of Christianity within a Caribbean context. But I really wanted to say as well that the two writers on the panel whose work I'm familiar with is intensely political. And yes, I certainly agree that writing should be political in order to affect our landscape. I really didn't have a question. I just wanted to say that in response to what the gentleman was saying in terms of the Bible, but it is coming into our discourse in our discourse as writers.
Thank you. Cyril, and then to the back.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Nietzsche, the great philosopher, said, every word is a prejudice. Just a little bit of a preamble there. Sam Selvon, the famous writer of this island, he once told me in Canada that he moved from England to Canada to be closer to the Americas. The question to the panel, to yourself of course, is the whole idea, if in our writing, the realignment of the Americas is somehow implicitly there. And I raise that question because Bill Clinton, politician, he said, I am a Caribbean man also.
Oh,
Very good.
Earl. The realignment of the Americas. Okay, all right. So as an objective, as an aesthetic and a political objective, right? The realignment of the Americas. Does anyone want to address that?
From the Americas.
Yes.
Certainly in my poetry, I think of the New World. You know, because my poetry arises out of a historical consciousness started in 1492. I keep saying that.
Yes.
And I think that, you know, the old world, new world alignment was created then. So in that sense, yes, I think we can consider ourselves part of the Americas in a historic sense, and also in terms of politically what has happened certainly since the late 19th century, you know, where the balance of power shifted from Europe to very definitely to the United States. And this, politically, we are a part of that whole paradigm.
Yes, yes.
But I don't, other than in my poetry, I certainly don't think about it as informing what it is that I'm writing. I don't know if anybody else does.
Anyone else?
Colonial Girls' School happens to be one of my favorite poems, written by our dear lady. And I would like to ask you a question. Namely, did you write it in a light-hearted, happy retrospect? And, you know, the way you started, the way you spoke about nothing at all, and then at the end, you know, you asked a rhetorical question.
Yes.
Let me just add that I don't think that there are students and even some teachers who do not quite understand what took place when you were and when I was a colonial girl.
Yeah.
I think that they believe that we lost a lot of everything, and I know that we did not lose anything. Matter of fact, we gained. So we built on what we knew, and then we took that forward to what was happening in the future. So,
thank you. Well, shall I?
Yes,
Okay, for people who don't know, it's a poem which I guess I wrote it in many different moods, as you asked. But I always say I had an excellent colonial education. Okay, I did. But so the poem is writing about what was missing from that education, which was anything about us. So the sort of chorus in it is there was nothing about us at all. And in the poem, I recall all the events of Black history really over a period of time, which meant nothing to us, like Lumumba in the Congo, or Marcus Garvey, or what was happening in the rest of the world, that we were never taught anything, but we knew everything about the wheat fields of Canada, or the rivers of Russia, or and all the kings and queens of Europe. So that is, you know, how I'm playing with it. And so, on the one hand, I think it's representative of all of us of a certain era, whether in the girls' school or the boys' school. My school really hates me because they think I'm writing about my school, but it's about a whole colonial experience where we were taught well, we were taught to be good little English men and women, but there was nothing about us at all. And I feel my job, the job of all of us here on this panel, all the writers in this room, all the creative artists, is to write ourselves back into that space. It is, I don't believe in killing anything. I believe in interposing myself in the spaces that have been left for me. So that's what, but I have to tell you something really sad. I went back to Montego Bay, the town in Montego Bay where I went to school, did a presentation to students, and there were students from my school there. And when I made that remark that I was writing about the colonial era, I was very saddened. A lot of the students says, "Miss, nothing has changed." And I realized that nothing has changed in the psyches of a lot of our children, because we have not transcended that whole colonial enterprise. All we've done is impose a new set of colonials and colonial thought on the educational process.
I just wanted to go back to the question raised by David about the Americas. Cyril. Right. And what is the Americas? I think that is a very important question for us, because the Americas is also the terror of the Americas, the slaughter of the Amerindians, the enslavement of Africans without any serious reparative measure. It is about a lot of things. It is about how then do we engage that. It is about the forgetting of the Amerindians as a presence in the Caribbean. It is a conscienceless approach to our presence here, our being here, and we meaning the, what you call it, the newly independent countries, have followed the very example, the same pattern. We have not remembered the Amerindians. We have not sought reparation for Africans. We haven't done anything new. We have just kept on with the same old story all along. So when we begin to talk about the Americas today, we have to begin to look at it in a new way. Not only the atrocities and so on, but there's also been hopes and dreams and rebellion and a whole number of things that constitute the Caribbean. And we have to deal with that if we are to really go forward today.
Thank you. At the back.
Hi, I just have a really short question. This was touched on before, but I wanted someone to sort of talk about it a bit more. I'm interested in genre and the role that genre plays in a sort of a discussion like this, specifically a genre like speculative fiction, so science fiction, fantasy, magical realism. Could someone sort of talk about how that plays into this discussion?
Thank you. Great question. Courtney.
Well, I suppose I just feel like it's a widening of our concerns in a sense, you know. It's the complete, like I was saying before, the complete entering into the complete realm of the imagination and using it as a way to talk about what's going on in our society today. Yeah, I think. No, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, join the club. I'm sorry. It's catching. Yeah. But I suppose, I suppose for us, it is like reimagining ourselves in a greater sense. You know, I think because the propaganda from the literary world about who we are is just, like I said, criminals. It is just like a struggle with identity. It is like just like an idea of us just being migrants who actually don't know where we actually come from. We can. Sorry, I've lost it again. Sorry.
I do want to stay with this question of genre because all of you in your keynotes. You mentioned that there are political consequences with generic choices, or certain generic choices fit or align with certain types of political representations. And I wondered if you all shared that view, you know, that certain genres are more suitable for addressing or for representing or imagining aspects of our experience in a way that is political. So it seems that Courtier, who has experimented with genre, you know, has given this a lot of thought. But it seems to me that science fiction in particular enables writers to think beyond given parameters, right? If only those imaginings would be accepted by publishers, of course, because then we hit against the expectations of publishers.
But I was thinking that, you know, if you take satire, if you look at how satire has been used over time in all countries, traditionally.
We have a master of satire.
Right. So I was just suggesting that there are all these opportunities for creative writers to employ different techniques of writing, and as a way to. This is what magical realism served in countries like Latin America, where to write the truth would get you killed the next day. And if you look at the art of, let us say, Latin America, some African countries, you know, it is a way of speaking the truth so that it's recognizable, you know, to the people to whom you're speaking, the people who are seekers after truth. Yes. But you cannot be accused of you know, direct statement.
Yes,
and
it's double talk. But
it's double talk. So this is why I mentioned the whole idea of all these different ways of approaching literature.
Lawrence, you wanted to ask a question over here. And then Marina had her hand up.
Yeah, is this working? Yeah. I just wanted to return actually to the politics of publishing. This was kind of forming in my mind yesterday when we were talking about the national literature. And I wondered, just by the way, I've been sitting in this old fire station and I've been thinking how engines went out from here to put fires out. And I'm hoping we're creating some fires here which are going to keep burning. I think what I want us to do is, there are a lot of initiatives here. I want to about interrogating ourselves about some of the initiatives here, like the Horlicks Urban Prize, for instance, and just this festival itself, which has been marvelous in bringing us all here together and having this kind of conversation. I'm going to place it this way. When we send writers up, and some of us are already there, Courtier has been talking about his experience, who are they going to have conversations with? Because a lot of the sort of reports one often gets from writers from outside England who seek publication in England or New York or somewhere is that there is no one to have a real conversation with in the publishing house because they don't actually understand your world. They don't understand your references. They don't understand the writers who have influenced you, that whole conversation. And I wonder whether maybe Bocas needs to be thinking, yes, it's great to send up. Congratulations again to Barbara. But perhaps we should be, and there are some people here, I know some people, we should be getting some editors to come here if we want to actually talk with them. Though I agree with Earl and other people have been saying, we need to have publishing houses here. And I know there are initiatives during the Carib Lit conversation yesterday, People Tree, Akashic Books, and so on. Oh, that's excellent. But that's what we lack here as a publishing house, because then we would have conversations with our editors who know our world and our audience. So I think that is going to be a very important thing. We still do need to go out there to get published. We still do need, I think that's going to always happen. But those people are not equipped as yet, or many, to have that conversation with us. I wonder what people on the panel think about that.
Sure. What do you think? Pankaj, this is speaking to your point about the ability of readers abroad to actually understand our politics, right?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential to locate that conversation in the countries where these writing is emerging from, because there's always the danger of being misunderstood or not being understood at all. The references being lost, and I think that's what I was talking about when I said that something has happened in India over a long period. It took a while for this conversation to happen, for a different kind of writing to emerge, which is not constantly explaining itself or explaining complex Indian realities to an international audience, but is confident that its references will be understood by the local audiences, the local readers there. But I think we need, I mean, quite apart from the fact of the need of setting up publishing houses, we also need a very vigilant critical culture, which doesn't allow mediocrity to pass unrecognized. And the role of literary journals become very important, something actually we have to do a lot of work on in a place like India. So that is also an important part of it. And I think one thing that we often forget is, unfortunately, the commercial side of it. That it should be possible for writers to make a living of writing, if not entirely of writing, then doing something else. One reason why so many people are attracted by the Anglo-American world is because they can actually, it's possible for them, it's viable for them to be full-time or at least part-time writers there. And as long as the local market for literary fiction or even genre fiction is immature, not big enough to sustain a writer, I think we'll keep seeing this sort of exodus of.
And I think that has to do with also, we here seeing ourselves as the Caribbean. We've been talking about Caribbean writers, but to what extent do people of the Caribbean share the writings of the Caribbean writers, so to speak? I think that we have a lot. I think the whole notion of being a small island is kind of tough, because. So I think that we have to we have to move towards broadening the appeal of Caribbean writers. And I think that that has been done in some instances. There are festivals in Guadeloupe, you know, and in the various countries, but we have to deal with that. The other thing I just wanted to say, the whole question of the language. We are still shy about, you know, speaking or writing in the language in which we speak and in which we live. I live in the Caribbean. I am going to write as a Caribbean person living here. My language would be the language that I speak and that reflects the landscape for me. And I don't want to feel inferior, you know, inferior or be made to feel inferior or even different or exotic. All that might be part of the story, but the fact is that I am writing from a legitimate place. And I think that we have to legitimize the Caribbean language. I mean, both as scholars, as writers, as critics, and so on. We have to be very sympathetic to that effort of people to engage a language in which they live. And if you can't live in your language, where can you live?
Absolutely. At the back, then forward to Marina, then back over to Kai, and then we'll see.
Good day to everyone. This question is directed to Mr. Lovelace and Ms. Senior. The question is, could you comment on the issue of language and representation, Caribbean writers? Because Ms. Senior, she dealt with part of the language and representation when you said in Canada they thought of you as primitive and not understanding English. And so you just started talking about it. So can you continue tackling that issue of language and representation?
Briefly.
Thank you.
Briefly.
Well, I was speaking about my first book. That's a very long time ago. And I really feel that the world is meeting us halfway in terms of language, because there are so many Caribbean writers now who are employing nation language, however you want to describe it. So I don't want you to go away feeling that that is a situation today. I'm talking about in the 80s. And Summer Lightning was one of the first books where I employed Creole as, you know, the language of narrative and dialogue and so on. One of the things I have learned over the years is, and I learned this by my third collection of stories, where I had an editor in Toronto who enabled me to understand. I mean, I think I was very arrogant in thinking that I'm writing this thing, it's up to you to, you know, to understand it or not. And what this editor taught me is that I could find ways of contextualizing the things that I was talking about that might be strange to a non-Caribbean reader without compromising my position. So for example, the way I write Creole is not, I mean, I don't have a political approach to writing Creole. I'm merely using it as a tool coming out of the mouths of the people who are speaking in my work. So I don't feel the need to spell it in a way that makes it look different. I really try to facilitate the reader as much as possible, because if you're a Caribbean, you're going to give it the right pronunciation. And if you're not, then why am I getting in your way? So I'm thinking of simple words, you know, that some writers deliberately will misspell. But I also learned that as writers, we can meet our readers halfway by trying to contextualize certain things. I'll give you one example. In one of my stories, I have a girl who is wearing a guzu around her neck. Do you know what a guzu is? See what I mean? Yeah. It's just a charm that you're given to protect you. So I wanted to keep, my editor wasn't saying you must take out this word. But I somehow in that paragraph, I found a way of explaining to the reader without explaining that this was a charm. So this is what I'm saying, that we also can find ways of facilitating the reading of our work while maintaining the integrity of the work.
But I just want to add that you actually made a political decision.
Yes, of course.
That you wanted to invite your readers in, and that you weren't going to.
I write for a reader.
You weren't insisting that the reader meets you in your space.
No, I did that at the start because, as I think we all start off very arrogant about our first work and very protective of or work. But since then, I've learned that, you know what, there's a kind of negotiation going on constantly. Yeah. That's how I feel.
Right. But I see the language as expressive of our world. And if we keep correcting our language and fixing it into accommodating someone else's world, no matter how well-intentioned, soon our world itself will have no meaning. Certainly it will not be able to, you will not be able to communicate your world if you don't use the words, for example, your frizzle or drizzle or...
Whistle. No, the word is there, you know. But I'm not taking the word out. But I'm saying Good. I'm finding a way of enabling you, if you read it, you would know what it meant.
Good. I would know.
You do know.
Right. So really what I'm saying is that we have to be very careful with this. I understand the business about meeting people halfway, you know. But I think that the world you're coming from needs to be expressed and to develop. If we can't develop, I mean, there's so many influences today that Trinidadians today speak a different Trinidadian than they spoke in my youth. You know, I mean, they're talking very much more American, for example, or they have certain words. I hear people saying, various words, you know. And I wonder where they come from. And they're really bona fide Caribbean people. They are exposed to a new language and a new space and so on. And I'm simply saying, not to make the thing archaic, but to keep abreast and hopefully to help with the language in our space.
Okay, thank you, Earl. Marina, Hannah, were you before Marina? Sorry.
Hi, I wanted to go back to what Earl said earlier on. Sorry, I'm Caitlin Camigan. You said, how do we take our place? I thought that was so well said. Not that you have to ask for a place because you're given a place, but how do you take it? I really wanted to go back to what I said yesterday, which came from should there be a national literature? Should there be, and today, should literature be political? It just seems to me that if you put should and political into the same sentence, isn't the conversation about shouldn't we raise the national literacy rate? And wouldn't so many of these things that we're discussing come about naturally? Wouldn't a national literature come about organically? Wouldn't your Caribbean-based audience, wouldn't it come about so much more naturally if the conversation was about raising the literacy rate? When I moved here, I read a statistic that in Trinidad, there's a 98% rate of literacy. And if I was to behave badly, Marina, I would just have to say I find that incredibly hard to believe, that there must be a very loose definition of literacy, because I don't really believe that there's a 98% rate of literacy. And that if you want to expand your Caribbean audience base, surely the discussion should be about national literacy.
Is it the job of the writer to increase literacy, or is that the job of governments? In other words, these are two separate things that work together, but I don't know that it's reasonable to be putting the burden on the writer to increase the rate of literacy. You know, I'm just asking you, why do you think writers should be the ones to have the burden of doing that? I don't quite follow.
I'm not sure I was actually suggesting that that's your job.
But what were you suggesting then, if you raise the issue here? I mean, no, I'm just trying to understand.
Well, okay, so if we're talking about should authors be political, should literature be political?
Actually, we decided to avoid shoulds. You noticed that I haven't used that word once, but you brought it back into the conversation. All right, but I think we're all in agreement that literacy needs to be increased in our countries.
It does just strike me that if the...
Okay, can we move on? Thank you.
I actually think my question is quite connected to literacy, because I wanted to ask you all how you think the issues of literature and politics are enabled by the internet. It seems to me that one of the ways that we have actually...
Your voice, not your,
my
not
voice,
your
sorry.
body. Yes.
One of the ways that we've seen the internet used extremely dramatically, for good or ill, whichever way, is for political association. for the creation of affinities transnationally.
Yes.
And since we've been discussing diasporic cultures and the need of audiences and readers to be represented to one another in more accurate ways than is demanded by the imperial or former imperial metropole, it seems to me that the internet could be a way of actually producing more of this dialogue that's needed. But it, of course, bypasses the market in some ways.
Yes.
So I would very much like to hear all of you, really, on that.
Any thoughts on this? Pankaj?
Yes, theoretically, but very few people have managed to make publishing on the internet work in terms of making it sustainable for the writer. And so that remains a problem. Of course, the internet is a great resource, and it should be possible for people to be in dialogue, or people should be talking to each other without the distorting mediation of multinational publishing houses. But how we do it is another question, and how we make it, viable also for writers to simply write and make it financially feasible for themselves.
Should writing or the presentation of writers be seen as a public service? I mean, should the government be No, it's a serious question. Should the raising of literacy be seen as a public service in which you involve writers and so on? There are a lot of new questions which we have to pose to ourselves, and we have not been posing them. We're thinking along one line, of what was the old way and so on. But maybe there are a number of questions which we have to ask again, and in which we employ government, which is our governments, which is to mean our money, to do things which we require today.
I suppose I do feel that dissemination of information, even though you can't monetize it, it is happening on the internet. You can find out information on the internet. You can reach people. You can tell your stories on the internet in a free way without that interruption from the multinationals. Without them getting involved. It's happening, but obviously people aren't making money out of it. They're blogging. They're getting their voices heard. They're reaching people in different ways. Like I know, for example, when the riots happened in London, there was a lot of information put out about the riots on the BBC, but you could find real information, true information, by people who were on the ground and people actually seeing things. They were posting up pictures, they were telling stories and stuff on the internet. So it does work in that sense as a mode of freedom of expression.
And can I just say that I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm 100% in favor of literacy. But just to connect it to the technology, somebody told me that boys are now far more interested in developing their literary skills because they have to phone girls, or use their phones to text girls. Seriously, and that's a way in which the technology is encouraging people because they can see the relevance of it to their lives. So,
And Kai has had his hand up over there. Is there a mic in that vicinity? And then over here, yes. Okay, you have the mic, so yeah, go ahead.
I'm up? Am I up?
Go on, speak.
It's okay. I started to address Ms. Senior's comments when she talked about the language. This goes back to the language or dialect. And then everyone jumped in on that. And I'm saying that we ought to really be embracing our own language, because you can't argue with the success of one fellow named Bob Marley, whose language transcended all borders and races and cultures. Not only his language, but his appearance, his dreadlocks, the colors, everything transcended, and it's all international. So what I'm saying with one of the writers, that we can't be afraid to use our language. Yeah. And sometimes I find that a lot of the pushback that you get from the editors are from the Caribbean. They're afraid for you to use your language because they keep telling you that you're not going to get an international audience, your audience is going to be too small, nobody's going to understand what you're writing, that sort of thing. So I like the way this discussion is going, where everybody's embracing their language And we shouldn't be afraid to use it because there is commercial success for this sort of thing once we know how to present it. So that's my comment. And
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do you have a mic?
Hi. It was a strange kind of question, building on from yesterday and today. Picking up from some of what Lawrence said, I have this idea of what might be considered the cosmopolitan writer, in which writers like me, I feel I'm implicated in that. And it's a dangerous cosmopolitan, I find. I think there's this idea of the cosmopolitan that really recuperates and reinstates several ideas of what was oppressive at another time. And so it seems to me that the cosmopolitan expands this idea, and it includes people like myself, it includes other races, other classes, and all of a sudden there are these writers of my generation who we're all of a sudden, we're cosmopolitan writers, and to establish ourselves as cosmopolitan, it means that we dismiss certain ideas of the national, of the local, of what becomes parochial, and that's exactly where we feel our savviness lies, our intellect lies, by that kind of rejection. And I wonder about the implication of another generation of writers in that category. And therefore my question is, for writers like that, can we become political enough? When we become suddenly implicated in that idea, and when we're just recuperating all these ideas of what was oppressive before, is our writing political enough? Do we raise the right kind of questions? Are we not too involved in a new system of oppression that just gets, gets called under a new name? And so the question is not whether writing should be political. Writing is always political. But I wonder if there's a kind of passivity that happens in my generation of writers. And I just wondered what the panel thought about it. No.
Okay, did you get that?
I really feel that writers should write what they want and should write about the things that they feel that could concern them. So while that can be a danger, I don't think the fault lies with the writers for writing in a cosmopolitan way. I think the fault lies with the infrastructure that takes those writers on board to the exclusion of other writers, who may be writing, local stories and telling local stories, I think, we can't just blame those writers at all for doing that.
Okay, let me ask you, is your discomfort with that category because you feel it's a product of the market? Is your discomfort? Yeah? Hold on. Oh, you didn't.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I just wanted to ask that.
Yes, that's exactly my discomfort. So it's really going back to several questions, that we become products of a certain kind of market. And it's just that I wonder how this new writer is formed, because I believe that we become formed by exactly what you're saying before, that it's the writer who knows how to snicker, knows how to roll his eyes at the ideas of mango, at the ideas of the wise grandmother. And we really become smug in that way by rejecting ideas of the national, by rejecting ideas of the local, and therefore we don't pose certain questions that I really feel that we probably should be posing at this time, because we're suddenly, without realizing it, implicated in new systems of oppression.
Okay.
Yes. I would like to know what kind of questions he has in mind, though. Okay?
Do you have an answer?
I mean,
do you have a response?
Well, I don't understand what the difference between the cosmopolitan and the what is the other one? Local. Is there a place that is called local and one? I'm trying to get no.
Well, the cosmopolitan writer could also be described as the transnational writer, the writer who moves between more than one location, right? Who lives in transnational space, as opposed to the local writer, who is someone who is based in the Caribbean, for example.
So I am a local writer.
You could be identified that way, and I could be identified as a cosmopolitan writer, but I would never accept that.
And I have been identified as a local writer.
So
locally in your space. Locally in my space, just recently. Yeah, so it does exist.
Okay, do you want to say something?
Oh no, I mean I think there is a general point to be made about a certain kind of shallow cosmopolitanism, which suppresses the regional, the local, the particular, the specific, and inhabits a kind of space where everything suddenly becomes very accessible or is made accessible. And that's the kind of, we've been talking about this, that's the kind of writing a lot of publishers prefer, even when they come from different corners of the world, but it is something they are confident of selling in the marketplace because all the markers, the references are easily digested. And as most of us have pointed out, obviously there's a danger of that kind of. I hesitate to call it internationalism because that's a word we haven't used at all. But that was the kind of word being used a lot in the 1930s and 40s. This cosmopolitanism is a new invention, relatively, the way we describe the cosmopolitan connected to the transnational. But that's another discussion. I want to go back to a point, and also another questioner made about language and representation. And it's something really interesting has happened in India quite recently, where writers are writing or using a kind of English, which is definitely not Queen's English, but it's a kind of English that's spoken by a vast majority of people who have not learned English in elite institutions. And it's a language now so widely spoken and so widely understood that it has now made its way into popular literature, which sells many, many more times than, say, literary fiction. I mean, these books are selling hundreds and thousands of copies, bought by people who would never pick up a book authored by me or by many of these other writers. So there's another way in which that kind of language is making its way into a very enlarged realm of popular literature. Yes. This is an interesting phenomenon.
Like Nigerian market literature, I think that's how it started.
Yeah. I've received the signal that it's time to finish, it's time to wrap up. We've had a really stimulating and productive discussion, I think, between the panel and the audience. And I hope we've really put to bed this question, should literature be political, with our very strong assertion and affirmation of the fact that literature is inevitably political. Thank you very much.